Good morning, and welcome to Tulane University. It is my pleasure to introduce our next session, Decarbonization, What the World Can Learn from Louisiana and Texas. If time allows, at the end of the session, the panel will take questions submitted by the audience. To submit a question, please scan the QR code located on the screen. Please be sure to silence your cell phones. Enjoy the conversation, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to our moderator, Daniel Shantz from the Tulane University School of Science and Engineering.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for joining us. I think we are what stands between you and lunch, so we'll try to make this time well spent. As mentioned, my name is Daniel Shantz. I'm an Associate Dean for Research in the School of Science and Engineering here at Tulane, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this forum on decarbonization. We have three excellent panelists with us today, and we're going to hit on a range of topics and then hopefully field your questions. So why don't I just begin by letting them spend a moment introducing themselves and giving you a little bit of their background. We'll start with you, Kera, on the end.
Oh, great. Hi, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you. My name is Kera Gautreau. I am Senior Director of the Houston Energy Transition Initiative, or HETI, at the Greater Houston Partnership. And my role at the Greater Houston Partnership is essentially to enable the Houston and Gulf Coast region to leverage our existing energy expertise, infrastructure, and leadership to not only be the energy capital of the world, but to be the leader of the energy abundant and low carbon future. In my background, I actually grew up just down the road in Ascension Parish and attended LSU for degrees in geology, and then have spent about 20 years in the global energy industry since then. A combination of leading and developing projects around the world for Chevron, as well as advising industry and private equity clients around mergers and acquisitions and regulatory and compliance obligations and reporting. So thrilled to be here with you today and excited for the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, and it's great to be with you today. I'm Lindsay Phillips. I lead the Gulf Coast program for a nonprofit called Clean Air Task Force. We work globally, but we have a regional focus, and in our work, we focus a lot on clean energy technology and reducing the barriers, solving the problems to the market, technology, and policy barriers that we see in clean energy deployment. Before that, my background, I came from Tulane University. The school looks a little bit different than it did about 10 years ago, but loved Tulane University. And I worked for Governor John Bel Edwards for about 5 years before joining Clean Air Task Force. So great to be with you this morning, and we're excited to talk about decarbonization.
My name is Greg Upton. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Energy Studies, as well as an Associate Research Professor there. So the Center for Energy Studies is a multidisciplinary research center that was actually created by the Louisiana legislature in the early 1980s. And so to give a little bit of historical perspective, and that will eventually kind of tie full circle to what we're talking about today, but back when the center was created, more than 40% of Louisiana's revenues directly came from oil and gas. That was just severance taxes and royalties. Today, that number's about 5%. And so really what we were created for was to provide information, to do research at the intersection of energy, obviously, but the economy and the environment, and then to provide that information not only to the legislators, the executive agencies, but also to the general public. So thanks for having me today.
Super. As you can see, we have a wonderful group here, diverse set of backgrounds. And so let's get into some questions. And maybe we'll start with you, Greg, and work our way back to Kera this time. So decarbonization is a phrase many people hear, bantered about frequently, may well mean different things to different people. For the purposes of this discussion and what you're thinking about, what does that phrase mean to you?
So I'm going to have to give you what a classic economist would say, of course, which is that, decarbonization is really fundamentally is what we call negative externality. So historically, if you think about the regulation, environmental regulation in the United States, you go back to the Clean Air Act in the 1960s, the amendment in 1970, then again in the 1990s. What the Clean Air Act and what regulation, environmental regulation was focused on was really thinking about localized or regional pollutants that were negatively impacting people that lived within proximity to those facilities. And so we've developed in the United States a regulatory framework around this. So we have attainment areas, non-attainment areas. If you go into non-attainment, we have regulations that kick in order to reduce those localized pollutants. And so it's very natural to think about what a cost-benefit analysis looks like for an environmental regulation. And by looking at, well, what are the benefits to the reduced pollutants to the people that live in proximity to these facilities, and what's the cost to society in order to reduce these? Greenhouse gas emissions is fundamentally different in that it's a global pollutant that impacts humanity over a very, very long time frame. And so if you think about for any given political jurisdiction in the world, including the United States, and especially including an area like Louisiana that's relatively small, if we incur cost in order to reduce carbon intensity, that's going to benefit the entire globe over a very, very long time period. And so this fundamentally is kind of how economists frame this decarbonization question. How do we think broadly about what is the effects of these greenhouse gas emissions on the globe? What is the time span for which they impact people? And how do we think about a regulatory environment in order to, again, pass that cost-benefit test of reducing emissions while at the same time making sure that the cost to do so in net benefits humanity moving forward? So that's a very technical econ-y answer for what decarbonization means.
Sure. Greg gave a great background on how decarbonization works. One of the other lenses to think of decarbonization through is just inherent in its name. It's decarbonizing. So it's reducing carbon in our atmosphere. As Greg mentioned, carbon is one of the most effective ways to combat a changing climate, a warming climate. So that's why we see a lot of industries who have made these announcements or declarations of reducing carbon by mid-century by a certain amount. So that's where the purpose of these decarbonization goals comes in. One of the indirect benefits that we see at Clean Air Task Force, where our mission is around cleaning the air, we see a lot of co-pollutant benefits of cleaning up the air and reducing carbon emissions. It can also result in reduced air pollutants like other criteria pollutants, other greenhouse gas emissions, hazardous air pollutants that can really improve public health and quality of life for a lot of our Louisiana communities that are heavily industrialized. So there's a big public health benefit that we can see to this technology as well. Though it may be focused on reducing carbon, it can also reduce other emissions. For example, we see in the world of carbon capture, it's called carbon capture because you're focused on capturing the carbon. But there's also this benefit of when you separate carbon in a stream, in an industrial process, you're also capturing other elements. You're capturing heavy metals, potentially sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, other pollutants that are harmful to public health and that won't then be emitted alongside carbon. There's also a lens of decarbonization that creates energy independence. I'm sure Kera will talk more about the industrial lens and how this sets up Louisiana and Texas for our future. But decarbonization can provide energy security and diversification. We've seen, as Greg mentioned, we've seen the ebbs and flows of the oil and gas market in states like Louisiana and Texas, where we go from having a lot of production and a lot of jobs to atrophying and having to lay people off in these firms that support oil and gas. Having energy diversification like renewables, nuclear, geothermal, having clean hydrogen and carbon capture, there are other tools in the tool belt that can help us not solely rely on one source, but have energy diversification while also creating clean jobs for our Louisianans and Texans.
Thanks. I'll build off of both of my fellow panelists' comments there. And the Houston Energy Transition Initiative and the Greater Houston Partnership really thinks about decarbonization and the energy transition more broadly from an economic development and opportunity creation lens. And so that's kind of the nature of how we think about decarbonization. Just to give kind of a broad overview, the Department of Energy estimates that about 20 to 30% of all U.S. Greenhouse gas emissions are coming from industrial sources. And so, at the partnership and as an industry-led strategic initiative focused on energy transition, we know that it's imperative for all of us to reduce these emissions from, these are very critical industries for our regional and national and even the global economy at large. But we must reduce the emissions from the industrial bases in regions like the Gulf Coast in order to meet our climate goals while continuing to create opportunities for economic development. And so we really see this as not only a challenge to overcome or an obstacle to overcome, but also as a real opportunity to create local, regional economic development opportunity for our communities.
Excellent.
And I'll talk a lot more about the details of technologies as well, but I'll leave it there for now.
And that's an excellent transition to the next question. If we're thinking a little more regionally specific, and I'll give you an either or to each of you, and we'll start with you, Kera, and work our way back to me. Are there specific challenges in this space in the Gulf Coast? Or if you'd prefer to point out an example of what I'll call a recent success in this space in the Gulf Coast region. So I'll give, it's like steak or chicken. We'll give the panelists the choice of which path they want to pick. So
yeah, no, I'm happy to continue on my comments there and talk kind of about, again, that lens of it. There are many challenges, but then we also see them as opportunities. So speaking from the Houston region, and really this applies to the Gulf Coast as a whole, we are home to many of those key industries that the Department of Energy identifies as critical for the economy, but also high emitting and hard to or difficult to abate. And so many people could look at that as a challenge, right? We have a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions from industry, which powers our economy. We also have a strong legacy of energy leadership to draw on to solve these challenges, and really a real sense of getting things done and the know-how to do these things, and not being afraid of those challenges. And so it's really, I think, a unique position for us to be in the Gulf Coast, that we have the existing energy leadership, the existing energy infrastructure, a wealth of expertise amongst sciences and engineering disciplines, and project development as well, right? That we know how to tackle big challenges. We know how to scale large-scale developments and projects, and so we know how to get these things done. So really it is our ability in the Gulf Coast region to both develop and implement these key technologies that are going to be able to address large-scale greenhouse gas emissions that is uniquely positioning us to continue to be the global leader in what we like to say is a future that is both energy abundant and low carbon.
And with that energy leadership, Kera, we have seen probably more, well, actually, not just probably, more announcements of clean energy in the Gulf Coast than we've seen across the rest of the country. There are other concentrated areas like Pennsylvania, California, Illinois, but not to the extent that we see clean energy announcements and projects that are forming in Louisiana and Texas. So we have those energy expertise, those existing facilities and infrastructure that can really enable the Gulf to be a leader in this area. Just to build on Kera's point, there's another area where I've seen a lot of surprising success in Louisiana and Texas, and that's on the policy and legislative front. In Louisiana's legislature over the past few years, they've taken a lot of leadership to pass policies specifically that enable technologies like carbon capture and clean hydrogen in the state. We certainly need some work on our legislation around supporting a solar and a wind environment in Louisiana, but there are some areas of success that we see, particularly in the carbon capture space. We've passed a number of policies that are enabling to carbon capture. Policy is really critical to de-risking these new technologies. And the Louisiana legislature, with a lot of stakeholder engagement, has built some policy options for how we advance this technology in the state. And everything from pore space ownership to mineral rights to liability. And no matter which way you fall on those policies, a lot of people disagree on how that should be shaped. But we do have that foundation that's set in Louisiana, which is why we have a lot of that development in the state, that development of carbon capture. In Louisiana, similar to Texas, there have been bills passed to create clean hydrogen task forces, and also the Policy Production Council in Texas, that are public bodies that are created to really study hydrogen and the future role that hydrogen can play in the Gulf Coast economy. This is already pretty widely used in a lot of our industrial processes, traditional hydrogen that does produce carbon, that does produce other pollutants. But when we talk about the world of clean hydrogen, there's a lot of interest and opportunity in the Gulf Coast. So it's really encouraging to see our lawmakers taking a proactive approach to this technology in particular by setting up these councils that will then really think proactively of how the states can position themselves well from a policy front to accelerate deployment of hydrogen. So those are some of the policy examples that I think show well the leadership in Louisiana and Texas that is a bit unexpected, being very conservative and heavy industry states.
Well, as it turns out, Dan, I like both steak and chicken, so I'm going to also take the opportunity and the risk to talk about. So I want to kind of frame this, think about a few stylized facts, which of course economists has to frame anything with stylized facts. So the first, I'm going to ask the audience to give me a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or a sideways, depending upon what your vote is with the following. What do you think has happened to energy demand in the United States over the last decade? So thumbs up, it's went up. Oh man, everyone's up. Any downs? Not a single down. Any sideways? One sideways. Okay, we got one sideways, and actually two back there, but he's cheating because I know Chris really well. So the answer is it's actually been really flat. Okay, so when economists model energy demand, we think about two things. On one hand, you have economic growth, which of course is going to lead to an increase in the amount of energy that you use within the economy. But on the other side, you have efficiencies, okay? And efficiencies are going to lead to this reduction in the amount of energy demand. And I'll give you a funny story. So my wife and I had our third child a little over a year ago. And when the child's born, we go out. She had a 2010 RAV4. I'm going to date her car here, okay? That we bought early when we were just got married. And third child comes along, we go out, we're like, oh my gosh, we can't fit 3 car seats in this car, right? So we go and we get her a Highlander, the 3-row SUV, the bigger SUV from Toyota. What do you think the fuel economy was of that Highlander relative to the RAV4 from 10 years earlier? Yeah, it was actually a little bit better. It was about the same. Do you think that we're going to drive more miles because, we get a little bit more fuel economy? No, we're not, okay? In the same year, we had very good luck. Not only do we have a kid and a new car, but our washer, our dryer, and our dishwasher all went out in like a 6-month period. So we got new car, new appliances. It's just wonderful, right? So what do you think happened to our electricity consumption? Well, we had a third kid, so it went up. But, aside from that joke, but it went down a little bit more efficiency. And so would I have gone out and purchased a new car and new appliances just for these energy savings? Absolutely not. My checkbook will certainly tell you that would not have made sense to do that financially. But eventually, when these things replace, you're going to go to more efficient ones. And in the United States, as well in Western Europe, we're kind of in a balance here, where energy demand has kind of been flat over the same time period. So now I'm going to do the same thumbs up, thumbs down, sideways. What has happened to the production of energy here in the United States over the same decade time period? So give me a thumbs up. Okay, some people saying thumbs up. Any thumbs downs? No thumbs downs. We got a sideways. Okay, so energy production has increased precipitously. We've had over a 90% increase in oil production over this time period, over a 50% increase in natural gas production, over a 50% increase in renewable energy production. So we've had energy demand has been relatively flat, while energy supply has been increasing. So this goes to the third question. Where has this energy gone? And the answer to that is the developing world. So we're exporting these products all over the world, and it includes, of course, liquid fuels, chemicals, plastics, fertilizers, all of these products that we're going to need in a decarbonized world. And so what we're seeing now with the Paris Accord, which countries representing over 97% of the globe's population have signed on to this, saying we want these lower carbon intensity products. And so what's interesting, when we look at Louisiana, when we look at the Gulf Coast region, in a way, our policies, not that they're not important, and we certainly should, get our policies in a rational way, but there's the demand for these products moving forward in order to be lower carbon intensity, and that is the big opportunity for us. The big challenge, though, is that in order to produce these lower carbon intensive products, of course there's going to be a cost to that. And so the question in my mind is, what is that global market going to be willing to pay for these lower carbon intensity products? And it's going to be that balance. It's a big opportunity for us selling these products to the world, but also making sure that the world will purchase those products, which ultimately will be higher cost to have a lower carbon intensity.
Excellent. Kind of following up on that, I'm going to put out to the group here, again, focused on being Gulf-centric, what are the key obstacles? And maybe one way you could take this is if you want to impinge on whether you think it's technology or policy or other things that potentially pose some of the largest challenges to realizing this. So why don't I start with you in the middle, Lindsay?
Sure. So policy, technology, and the economic landscape, they're all barriers. They all can be barriers to clean energy deployment. We've talked a lot about the industrial sector and the different options that there are for the industrial sector, because that's a big market in the Gulf Coast. And we can also bring in the lens of clean energy here as well in our power production, which is primarily natural gas and not so much renewables. I think we're about at 1 or 2% of our energy comes from renewable production. So all of these factors, the technology, becoming market ready, the market mechanisms and the financing, that can be a barrier as well as the policy. From the technology sense, we have a lot of the technologies that can decarbonize our industrial sectors and that can be deployed for power generation. But many of these are in early stage deployment and early stage development, even some of them. We can look at sustainable aviation fuel, which a lot of airlines you might have seen have said that we're going to use sustainable aviation fuel by a certain date to decarbonize jet fuel, to decarbonize our airlines. The demand is not quite there yet because we haven't quite figured out how to develop these processes at a scale where it can be used on the market. You can look at industrial boilers that are used in a lot of industrial processes, electrifying these components. There's piloted technology, but is it scalable yet? Not really. In a similar sense, you can look at what we've talked about before, carbon capture, hydrogen. They're all a very similar conversation. In the clean energy front, you can also look at nuclear and geothermal technologies that says the same story. So a lot of the challenge is that these promising decarbonization technologies are not yet scalable to what we need. And since they are early stage, the costs are very high. So there's not much demand and the supply is low. And even when these alternatives are available, industrial facilities are very complex and they have incredibly intricate processes. When we look to switch out one unit part or one process, it's not as easy as just a plug and play of that specific singular unit. It really can affect the whole process that we see at an industrial facility. In the power perspective, we can sort of plug and play technology a bit better. We can deploy a nuclear reactor, an advanced nuclear reactor, instead of building a new power generation facility. So that technology could be a bit easier to deploy. There's also, so there are those barriers of just not having the scalability that we need yet for these technology, which has really driven up costs, which makes it hard for there to be early off-takers. The other lens is that there's also just a lack of technology in some areas of the industrial sector. You look at cement production, steel making, chemicals production, they require high heat processes, and we're talking over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. There's just no substitution for fossil fuels yet. So we could use electricity. It doesn't get quite as high as we need for these processes, so we can't do that component switching, that unit switching of a electrified unit. So we have to rely on fossil fuels in that area for now. But with all this innovation that's happening in the space, there's a lot of opportunity for us to keep trying to solve that problem, to keep trying to develop the technology that we need for that solution where we only have fossil powered right now. And then in the policy front can be another barrier. As Greg mentioned, having an enabling policy environment is really important for these technologies to be successful, also for them to be deployed in a safe and effective manner, for there to be transparency with the public and an understanding of what these technologies are, education around how they'll be deployed and built in communities. If there isn't clear regulation or permitting, that can be a big barrier for deploying new technologies, and everything from renewables, like we see it in terms of siting solar in Louisiana, to large-scale industrial facilities. It can increase costs, it can delay project timelines, and it drives up the risk that investors have to take on when they're developing these new projects. So those are just a high level of some of the cost, policy, and technology barriers that we see to the deployment of both clean power and the industrial sector.
Yeah, I think, Lindsay, you covered most of the bases that I was going to cover, so I'll just add a little bit of color to that. We agree and see, obviously there's a lot of emerging technologies and innovations in the clean energy space and climate tech space. From the Houston lens, I think we're really uniquely positioned as well to advance some of the key technologies, like you mentioned, around sustainable aviation fuel, and then alternative fuels just in general or more broadly, because we have that intersection of key industries like energy, life sciences, and aerospace. We're seeing a lot of those collisions, if you will, in terms of that emerging technology space that I think are really going to be promising, especially when we think about the emergence of alternative fuels. But as you said, I think it's always going to be about demand. But I think we also see the challenge of economics, and really that's being influenced by both policy and incentives as well. And so our member companies who are trying to develop very large scale, either carbon capture or hydrogen projects in the region, are faced with, potentially marginal economics right now, even for those major capital investment projects. And so we're hearing from our members across the board that, in the policy space in particular, there need to be additional incentives. So the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, was a great catalyst for a lot of these at-scale deployments of new technologies around carbon capture and clean hydrogen production. But we need to see more of that and build on more of that. And clearly there's some uncertainty in that policy landscape right now with the political change that we're seeing. But we're hopeful and we're counting on the IRA provisions to remain in place, especially around 45Q, I would say, which are the provisions and incentives around carbon capture and storage, and potentially as well with 45V, so that we can also develop the clean hydrogen ecosystem. In the Texas region, we were awarded a grant we are in the process of being awarded a grant from the Department of Energy for the High Velocity Clean Hydrogen Hub, which potentially is, up to a $12 billion local investment in the region. And so we're really excited about that and hope that will materialize, with a number of projects in the queue there. And I guess I'll finally just touch on, de-risking as well and echo Lindsay's comments there, that I think in a very general sense, de-risking is going to be critical. We're seeing right now in the current investment environment that a lot of capital is left on the table, or on the sidelines, I should say, particularly when it comes to emerging climate tech, so echoing Lindsay's comments there. And so I think de-risking is going to be a big focus for those climate tech startups that have a viable technology, to get them to pilot, to get them to demonstration, to prove that they can be successful at commercial scale is going to be key.
So if you look back to the IIJA being passed, which of course included lots of decarbonization investments, and then the Inflation Reduction Act, which was even more decarbonization investments, what we're seeing now is there's a lot of money and a lot of subsidies for a lot of these investments moving forward. But when I talk with companies that are implementing these, and Lindsay and I actually sit on the Clean Hydrogen Task Force that was created by the legislature, What you hear is that while the money's there, the tax credits are there, they're moving forward to get projects permitted, kind of the practical piece of it, and that is really where we're hearing a lot of holdup. So one example of that is with the 45V tax credit, which is for hydrogen. And there's a lot of, there's still a rulemaking that's still ongoing about how exactly that tax credit's going to work. Yeah. And so if you pass the bill and there's the funding there and people move forward with projects, the nuances of how that's actually going to be implemented really impacts these projects. And so if you don't get the regulatory framework out ahead of time, it's very hard for companies to move forward with that. I also see Justin Crossy with the Department of Energy and Natural Resources here in the audience. This is, I think, an example of a regulatory success of the department working closely with the EPA in order to get Class 6 primacy for these carbon sequestration wells here in Louisiana. And so that's an example of, and that was, by the way, bipartisan, first the Edwards administration, now the Landry administration, working hard in order to get that regulatory environment in place in order to move forward with that. The other big challenge that I see on a daily basis is really around these communities that are now receiving these decarbonization investments. And I want to talk a little bit, I want to allude back to what I said at the very beginning, where if you think historically about investments in pollution abatement or pollution reductions, the people in proximity to these investments for pollution reductions were the people that benefited from that pollution reduction. Their air quality was better, their water quality, whatever the investment was. But now that we're talking about decarbonization investments, that the benefits of that accrue to the entire globe over a very, very long time period, a lot of these communities are increasingly coming to the table and saying, look, perhaps this passes a global cost-benefit test in terms of the cost to society of reducing these emissions relative to the benefit of that. But what about me for a community? How is my community impacted by this project? And I think that is very, very closely tied with the regulatory process, where if you have a transparent regulatory process, the rules are in place not necessarily to promote or push the projects forward, but to actually thinking about, hey, there's this community these investments coming into. Will that community actually in net benefit from that? I think is really, really important. And I won't cite examples, but I've seen examples of regulators saying, hey, look, I'm going to do this kind of pro policy in order to get this thing moving forward. And perhaps that could be beneficial, certainly in the short run, to get projects going. But then you kind of get that community backlash, if you will. And so this is another big challenge of kind of getting that right and having the balance in there.
Super. Wonderful answers. Very insightful. So we have about 3 minutes and change before we open it up to the audience for questions. So I'm going to put the panelists in a very difficult spot here in that I'm going to give them about a minute apiece to touch on what they think is the long-term vision around decarbonizing the Gulf Coast and or how do we get there. And Kara, I'll start with you. So.
Yeah, I'll go first since I failed to mention the report that we just published a couple of weeks ago on this. So let me give you a quick rundown. We were excited to partner with the RMI, or the Rocky Mountain Institute, and the Mission Possible Partnership with a grant from the Bezos Earth Fund to define outlook scenarios to 2050 for the Houston region on industrial decarbonization benefits. We were able to identify 4 primary decarb levers and technologies that you won't be surprised to hear about from what we've been talking about: electrification, energy efficiencies, clean hydrogen production, and point source carbon capture and storage. And we also looked at 3 scenarios to 2050 in terms of decarbonization. So if we continue on a business as usual trajectory, how will that impact our regional emissions? And then what would it actually take for the region to get to net zero by 2050 in terms of all of these levers plus additional ones that would be needed, and then what that cost could be to the local economy. And then a mid-case scenario, which we call a selective investments. And so that was employing a weighted average regional cost of abatement threshold, if you will, so that only economically viable decarb technologies and levers would be implemented. And we're very pleased to share that in the selective investment scenario, we could reach around 60% emissions reductions in the regional economy by 2050 and add 14,000 jobs on an annual basis to the Houston region. And then for our net zero scenario, we would obviously achieve zero emissions by 2050, and we'd be adding up to 21,000 jobs per year to the regional economy. So we hope that this is a blueprint for other industrial-based regions to follow as well. I'm happy to share a link if anyone's interested to see that report.
I'm going to lean on that economic point. There's a lot of future value for the Gulf Coast from an economic perspective of energy transition and of clean energy that can really be our future if we lean into it in 2025. So there's the opportunity, one, just for new job creation. We've heard a lot, particularly from Kera, about all the investment that we're seeing in the Gulf Coast, and from Greg about the world is looking to the Gulf Coast to produce these projects and these products that they can use then globally. So this has a lot of opportunity to create jobs for our local economy. And as I mentioned in the beginning, create diversification as well, so that we have steady jobs for our communities as well, that isn't relying on just one production stream. This also is really interesting because the jobs that we have currently in the oil and gas space, whether that's onshore or offshore, is readily transferable to the clean energy sector. Rather than welding and pipe fitting, as our trade schools do very well, rather than doing that with natural gas pipelines, it could be carbon dioxide or hydrogen pipelines that they're welding and fitting instead. In our professions, we need engineers just as much in creating clean hydrogen facilities and carbon capture facilities that we need in the existing oil and gas market. And a similar side when we look to the offshore environment. Rather than developing offshore oil and gas, we can use those exact expertise for offshore wind with just a little retrofitting. So the Louisiana and Texas economy has a big opportunity here if we lean in, if we provide the right skills and retooling programs to really help our economy and our residents lean into this opportunity economically.
Nationally, transportation and electricity generation are the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions, with industrial kind of in a distant third place. Here in Louisiana, 2/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions are industrial. And so for us here in this region, it's really this balancing of that cost competitiveness and that emissions reductions.
Again, please join me in thanking our panel before we open it up to the floor. So I believe we've hit the Q&A session. Hopefully some of you utilize those QR codes.
We do have a few questions.
Excellent.
Let's start with, how will blue hydrogen production affect decarbonization efforts in the Gulf Coast?
Who wants that one?
Anyone want to start?
You want to take that, Lindsay?
Yeah, sure. So blue hydrogen, just for the audience's awareness, there's a color scheme that is talked about very frequently in the world of cleaning hydrogen. So blue hydrogen is traditional hydrogen production plus carbon capture. So you're still using natural gas for hydrogen production, but you're capturing the carbon and potentially other pollutants that are also produced from it. Blue hydrogen can play a big role in Louisiana and Texas in terms of decarbonization. We've seen billions of dollars of investment in blue hydrogen in both Louisiana and Texas. Kera mentioned the hydrogen hub that they have in Houston. It's called the High Velocity Hub. And a lot of that centers around building out a hub of infrastructure for blue hydrogen to succeed. So blue hydrogen, as long as it is paired with carbon capture and a measure of accounting for upstream methane emissions, then you really can clean up the process of hydrogen. As I mentioned at the beginning, in Louisiana and in Texas, we use hydrogen a lot for existing industrial processes in chemicals production and in refining particularly. And the Gulf Coast has the highest concentration of both chemicals and refining facilities. We already use hydrogen. So there's a big opportunity to produce hydrogen and use it here in a clean fashion. And as Greg mentioned, clean hydrogen is an asset that Louisiana in particular has gotten a lot of interest globally and from other nations in the developing world for us to be a producer to them of clean hydrogen. And if you convert clean hydrogen to ammonia, which transports much easier, you can then put it on a ship and barge it to other nations. So it has a big opportunity for us here in Louisiana and Texas, but also for us servicing the globe.
And I'll just add really quickly, in the Houston region, we produce currently 40% of the nation's hydrogen, and so it's a big opportunity for decarbonization for us, especially on blue hydrogen, as you said. That high velocity hub is approximately 70% blue hydrogen opportunity planned.
So I think just very basically, I believe that the future of energy is going to include both molecules and electrons at like a very, very basic level. I think we're going to see an increase in the electrification in the United States, and I think globally this is going to occur. But I think that we're still going to have some molecules moving forward. And the question is, what are going to be those molecules? So there's two big options. Of course, the first that we're talking about now is going to be hydrogen. So that's when you take hydrogen, you combine it with water, that creates hydrogen, combine it with oxygen, that creates water, and you get energy out of that. And so that's going to be one potential path forward to having decarbonized molecules. The other path forward is, of course, bio-based feedstocks for all these products. So instead of extracting fossil fuels from the ground, which was just photosynthesis from millions and millions and millions of years ago, we can use photosynthesis today to get those same bio-based feedstocks, but without having all this extraction of carbon all at one time for millions of years. So that's really kind of the way I think about it, and the kind of two paths forward. And of course, it's not one or the other, but certainly could be both of them.
Can you touch on your view of the clean energy complex by Air Products in Ascension Parish, Louisiana?
I'm only from there. I don't have the expertise from Air Products. Maybe you two do.
So just as being a university employee of a state university, we just have a policy to not comment on individual projects. So I'm going to choose not to comment on that.
Okay.
And similarly, we don't take positions on projects. We support technologies and their deployment in a safe, effective, and transparent manner, but we don't take positions on specific projects.
Yeah, and same for us. The partnership does not take positions on individual companies or projects.
Okay, thank you. What thoughts do you have on how to motivate local governments in another direction on these projects?
Well, I think the answer to that is twofold. Number one is and reasonably, there should be a revenue stream to local governments for economic activity that occurs within that jurisdiction. And so one of the questions we're seeing with the tax session right now is, what are those revenue streams? So I give you a basic example, but in Louisiana, we've had, of course, oil and gas extraction for a century now. We have a severance tax on the oil and natural gas that's extracted, and some share of that severance tax is statutorily dedicated back to the parish in which that is produced. And so when we look at these new technologies, there's a lot of discussion of what will be those revenue streams. And so I think that that's a healthy conversation that we're having. The other piece of it, of course, what is the regulatory environment thinking about the cost benefit from the local perspective? And I think this just can't be talked about enough. Yes, we need to be concerned about cost benefit of policies from a global perspective. And the federal government put out two documents, OMB Circular A4 in November of last year, and then the updated social cost of greenhouse gases, not to get technical. But both of those really said from a global standpoint, how do we think about cost benefit analysis? But really talking about what is that local cost benefit. And of course, one of those benefits is the revenues that comes to these local governments.
Those are great points, Greg. It's also incredibly valuable to work with local governments on just information sharing about these new technologies. A lot of governments first hear about this when a facility is going through a permitting process or a pre-permitting process and following some sort of regulatory code that they need to. And if we, as the state, as nonprofit stakeholders, as industry, from all across the spectrum, this can be done well. But if we do proactive engagement with communities and help them understand these new technologies that are coming into their communities, that might come into their communities, to really talk through the risks and the concerns and what they want from the projects, that will really be a paradigm shift for these projects as we move forward, so that they have a good understanding of what these technologies are. We see a lot of headlines that are very polarized in one direction or the other, that are pro a certain technology deploying everywhere or anti it deploying anywhere, and say that there are a lot of safety concerns and risks of this. And as people, we get our information from news outlets often on what is happening, and these scary headlines can often create a lot of fear locally, which is very understood if you're going to have projects in your backyard. So understanding and having this partnership from the beginning that really breeds transparency as a project moves forward is going to be critical. I mentioned the other lens is creating meaningful community benefits. I'm sure you've heard a lot about community benefits the past few years as part of the IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act, that are bringing these clean energy investments into communities, and whether it's from states or industries or locals, they all have a requirement to create community benefits. That can look like labor agreements, specific investments in communities, the Justice 40 initiative. But a lot of times, the project applicant is looking for sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to community benefits. And there needs to be an intentional effort to understand, what does this community need? And it won't be similar even to the community that's down the road. Particularly in a small community versus in an urban area, those needs are going to be very different. So being intentional to work with communities, understand what benefits they would like to see from the project before that application is submitted is really important.
Yeah, and I'll add that as a regional economic development and essentially Chamber of Commerce organization for the greater Houston area, we really think about this in terms of a portfolio approach. So the partnership's policy and advocacy division has gone into the community and done a series of surveys around energy transition, emerging technologies, and community awareness, which has been really helpful, I think, in order for industry to kind of understand that dynamic. But more importantly, I think as well, HETI as an initiative has convened an advisory board where we bring together local leaders, so leaders from the city of Houston, from Harris County, from local nonprofits, from the academic sector, and others, and environmental focused organizations. So that we're all in this together, so to speak. We take an all of the above approach to the technologies and solutions, but also when we think about community engagement as well. And we published a white paper earlier this year that develops a framework for effective community engagement. And really, it's about two-way dialogue with community leaders and understanding that this is a partnership and that they are expert. You may be an expert in the technology around energy and energy transition that you are implementing and developing, but you have to be on a level playing field with the community leaders because they are the experts in what their community needs. And so I think this has been really encouraging, particularly for new players emerging in the region as well.